It's not, I just need to commit it to memory so that later I could create. You're already shaping your character when you're engaging with the lines. You're already physicalizing circumstances, relationships, and facts. You're already molding yourself inwardly to become more like character, or you're doing none of it. And ultimately, it's either a wasted time at the end of which, yes, your head knows the lines, but the way that you learn them and the fact that they're in your head is only going to interfere with the rest of your creative process. Or you submerge the lines where they really belong, and now they're going to guide you through the rest of your creative process.
All right. Hello and welcome everybody to the third episode of Unlocking Creativity, Conversations in the Demidov School. My name is Nolan Henley. I'm an actor and voiceover artist based in New York, and I am a teacher in training with the Demidov School. And with me, as always, is Kimon. Kimon?
Hey, everybody. And I'm not that special, so I'll go to someone very, very special, Andre Malaev Bubble. And thank you so much for being with us again today. I feel guilty. I feel like we're picking your brain every time.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. And of course, Kimon is being very modest. He is a brilliant teacher and actor who is in Athens, Greece, and also is at the moment, like Nolan, in the fourth year of teaching certification program with the Demidov Association. And obviously, we've just taught a class, right? And we've done a lot of things that are all about experience. Now it's time to talk theory. Demidov is very clear that practice should come ahead of theory. And that's exactly what we've done today, right? We taught a class, and now we're about to talk about, but what is it that we are discussing today, Nolan?
Yeah, so for those who are watching for the first time who might not know, of course, this is Andre, and Andre is a master teacher and really the reviver of the Demidov School in the world today. So let's dive into the topic of this week. And really, I kind of want to get right into the nitty-gritty of theory right away and a little bit of language, because today we're going to be talking about memorization, which is obviously such a huge thing to actors and is often kind of scuttled away into the side of the room of acting training. And it's kind of thought of this like, oh, kind of go do that on your own sort of thing. And so we're going to bring it into the light today and have a conversation about it. But one of the first things I wanted to ask about was, we really don't use the term memorization in the Demidov School at all. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit just to get us started.
Yes, we avoid using that term because to me, memorization is connected with the head, right? It is my attempt to squeeze my lines into my thick skull to memorize them, right? Mm-hmm. And somehow the strange thing happens. If this is where my lines go, and if this is where they stay, then in order to reproduce them on stage, I'll have to fish them out of my brain, out of my head. As a result, where am I going to be centered? In my head. And that is the worst place for an actor to be centered. Memory is also something that kind of doesn't belong to the realm of subconscious, right? Because it's more peripheral. And so if I memorize something, and especially if I did not memorize it correctly, I will constantly be worried about whether I have the next line, right? And if I'm not quite sure what my next line is, I will again be going to my head, trying to recall it, trying to remember it. And each and every one of you, people who are listening to us, can imagine for a second recalling something, trying to remember something. Where is all of your being going to be centered at that moment? In your head. You're literally going to your head in order to have that information available to you, right? So again, not for a second should an actor be centered in their head, because no matter how you look at the question of an actor center, Michael Chekhov suggested that it is a heart center, actor's creative center, right? And Demidov specified it a little bit, as he tends to do, to specify it, and says solar plexus, right? Solar plexus. So, and again, I think he is absolutely correct. It's a very important correction, but ultimately it is not in the head. And the moment when you find yourself in your head on stage is the moment when you drop out of character, drop out of circumstances, drop out of the creative space, which is why one thing is clear: memorizing your text is not an option, because you will always be in your head. Therefore, you will always be self-conscious. You will always be watching yourself more and aware of yourself more than an actor can be, in order to be able to yield to character, in order to be able to yield to the circumstances that are characters. So that's one thing that makes us want to ensure, at least, right, that we are not memorizing. What is it that we are doing? What is it that we're actually substituting memorization with? Well, that's probably a next question.
That is exactly my next question, Andre, which is, this sounds, I like to put myself in the shoes of someone that has no idea what we're talking about at all, the perfect beginner. And they'd say, well, that sounds wonderful. How do I do that?
Well, if you are training in the Demidov School, if you're taking, let's say, an intensive with us, or if you're taking a summer course, or perhaps even enrolled in the acting certificate course, which is a 2-year comprehensive course, you always start in the same place. You start with Demidov etudes. And so if you're a beginner, we're not going to, in any shape or form, bother you with all of these things that we are discussing today, because you are supposed to be practicing. And as we said in the beginning, the most important thing about practice is that it should precede theory. So things that we are talking about today, we wouldn't be sharing with any beginners, so that actually not to put obstacles in the way of their creative process. So Demidov would tell you, okay, so how about we just take a very simple text? For example, Nolan, you will ask Kimon, how do you like this weather? And Kimon, you will say back to Nolan, the weather is great. And just repeat it a few times. And you begin to repeat these lines, just repeating them. That's where the beginning is. Oh, I'm just going to repeat it a few times, right? Repeat, not memorize. I'm just going to repeat it. And that immediately takes away the responsibility to retain, to keep, to memorize, to record it into my head. All of these things that are ultimately ending up with the act of memorization, right? And the act of memorization is also probably very often going to be not very thorough and successful, because I'm going to paraphrase a lot of things. I'm going to also remember, or memorize rather, some of the lines better than others, which means it's going to be very patchy. And that approximation is going to then result into approximation of my work on stage. But that can happen with the other way of retaining the lines, right? That is not memorization as well, right? We have to make sure that it's thorough. But again, the other way of retaining the lines is a way where head has nothing to do with it. So yes, there is a term, right, which we can mention, and that is assigning. The lines in Demidov are not memorized, that they're assigned. But no such thing as assigning is ever going to be mentioned to the actors to begin with. They'll be asked to repeat it. Just repeat it a few times, right? Just repeat it. So, and again, it's going to be a very careful work on the behalf of the teacher to make sure that the lines go where they're supposed to go rather than into the head. That we are bypassing the head and sending this line somewhere else. Again, we are on a very slippery slope now, right? Because if we use the term subconscious, we're going to possibly put a lot of people into their heads, because they will begin to worry about it. How do I actually submerge my lines into my subconscious? By not thinking about it, right? That's another interesting thing that precludes us from memorizing, which is deadly, because the head kicks in, right? We're just repeating the lines, and remember, in Demidov, we are not trying to interpret them. We are not trying to decide what they mean. We are not trying to find objectives for them or some kind of circumstances. We are not in any way processing them through our head in that way, in the analytical way. Because that's another thing that keeps actors stuck in their head, right? We are just nonchalantly speaking through the lines, not knowing at all what they might mean, and leaving it to the moment when we are on our feet with these lines to find out what it is that they actually begin to mean and do to us and do to the partner, and so on and so forth, right? So ingenious way on behalf of Demidov to keep an actor out of their heads, to not actually let them memorize the lines, but engage them in a completely different process, and also to keep them away from early, premature, unnecessary, and ultimately harmful analysis, which is where everybody begins, right? What does it mean? Let's think about it, right? How do we interpret it? How do we actually, justify it, and so on and so forth? And before you know it, the lines are turning into something else that they may not even be, or they are being shrunk to just a fraction of their meaning, because that's what interpretation is, rather than here are the lines, I'm repeating them, I'm not thinking about them. That's the way, gentlemen, that they actually gain tremendous power. The mechanism of that power has a lot to do with, again, where they go, because then they go directly into our subconscious self, and our subconscious self can do with these lines much more than our limited intellect can. Even if we are dealing with a very smart person, their intellect is still very inferior to their mighty, powerful, and all-knowing subconscious.
One of the things that I, kind of wanted to take out of that and sort of highlight is, and it's so simple, it's so easy to miss it. But, especially since you don't introduce any students to this, any kind of theory right away, and that they're just kind of repeating these lines back and forth, agreeing, I'll say this, you'll say that, in a way. Mm-hmm. And in that repetition, what they're doing is saying the lines out loud. And I think so many young actors specifically, and I always kind of think about young actors because I've worked with a lot of younger actors than myself, is they're always memorizing their lines just in their head, which is exactly where we don't want them to end up. And so I think, I just kind of want to bring attention to that, because I think that's part of sort of the, the wonderful power that this sort of approach lends, is without, reciting the lines in your head over and over, they have a much better chance of having such a deeper resonance in you when they're spoken out loud.
Absolutely. And you know how very often directors, especially with younger actors or teachers, are saying, cannot hear you, louder, louder, I cannot hear you, right? Well, how did these actors memorize these lines? Silently. Or whispering. Why? Well, in many cases, they didn't want to disturb someone. They were in the same room with somebody else who was, studying or doing something else, and they could not possibly actually speak these lines aloud. So they kept whispering them, or as you mentioned, Nolan, thinking them. Now, it assigns. Not only the lines assign, but apparently the conditions under which you engage with the lines also assign. They assign to your system. So when you are whispering your lines, or when you are actually just thinking them, what assigns is, I will not be speaking them. or I don't want to speak them. So needless to say, that impulse to speak doesn't come when you're on stage. Why? Because you engaged with the lines again and again and again and again at home in a silent or just thought kind of manner, right? So that's one thing. Second one is something you mentioned already. When lines are pronounced, vibrations are engaged. And these vibrations are real. These are real energies that can actually mold you to become more like a character, right? They can mold you to find yourself in the character's shoes, in the character's circumstances, because vibrations that happen as I speak right now, they're real, they're tangible, they're physical, they're real energies, and they're real shapes. In the beginning was the Word, right? And you can feel whatever you want about the Bible, right? We are not selling here any religion whatsoever, right? But there are a couple of very wise books, right, that survived through thousands of years, and certainly Bible is one of them, but it's not the only one, right? In the beginning was the Word. Think about it. Not thought, not deed, right? And then it takes Faust, Goethe's Faust, right, to begin to think about it as scientists do and decide that no. What the Bible says when it says in the beginning was the Word is really in the beginning was the deed, right? So look at it, how interesting, right? And every scientist is going to do that heady thing and ultimately find out something different. But that's not what it says. In the beginning was the Word. Then how did the Word create everything around us? Well, what about vibrations? If that word is spoken in a very particular way, through vibrations, perhaps it can shape things. It can actually mold things. It can put things into being, right? At least that's what that book implies, right? Let's not worry about that again, right? We believe whatever we believe, and that's absolutely fine. But the Word is where it all starts. That's what we get from the playwright. In the beginning was the Word, right? Because I'm very sorry, because someone gave me that word, gave me that play, there was nothing. Oh, perhaps there were images, and perhaps they were myths and legends and fairy tales and my life experience and all of this stuff that I have, including what I have in common with the rest of the humanity, because humanity has a lot of common roots. Take myth, fairy tale that I already mentioned, right? Sagas and all of this kind of folk, rich folk heritage that a lot of us share. Needless to say, we all draw from it. And yet, it probably started also as a word, because spoken word, of course, precedes the written word. It all started in a storytelling kind of a way, right? So in the beginning still was the word. And as far as we're concerned, the playwright gives us a play, the words are there. And if we want to evoke the conditions under which that word will already begin to turn into characters, circumstances, relationships, which is our job to embody these words, then we better speak them out loud. But not speak them out loud trying to predetermine intonations, operative words, or stress words, right? Not trying to already decide how we're going to speak them, but just to engage with the sounds of it, so to speak. So that will actually be a much better way of beginning your work on the character, relationship, and circumstances, rather than memorizing the lines, engaging with the words on a completely different level, just by speaking them and not trying to pre-decide how they're going to sound and how they're going to come out of my mouth, so to speak, because I'm yet to become that character. That character is in me already. I'm yet to embody it.
It's Andre, it's funny you say you were talking about vibrations, and I think I read somewhere a long time ago though that at the time of Shakespeare, everybody was afraid of the bard because he was like a magician. I mean, if he wrote something, it stayed forever. If he made a comedy about you, it was there, following you forever. And they were talking about how the word spelling, it means spell. So it's already magic. Like the word is there. If you use the vibrations, there's already going to be magic there. But one of the things is before I came to you, and this is years ago, I used to go through the route of a very specific technique. And this technique used to go into memorization, in a sense, through the mechanism of by rote. Meaning, you say the words as if you're saying a Hail Mary. And I want to talk to the people about the difference that I felt when I started assigning. And there was a huge difference for me because I knew the words when I was doing them by rote. I mean, it was by rote. So I knew them, inside out. But the place they came out of when I was playing, it's not the same place they come out of when I'm assigning. So after I've assigned, I feel they come from somewhere deeper than the surface. So just wanted to mention, the difference by rote, which is a good mechanism for some people, but this is quite different.
You want to assign your lines into a much deeper place. That is absolutely true. Whatever you are assigning, so to speak, or memorizing into your head will always be peripheral and will come out of peripheral part of you. And whatever you assign into the depth of the depth will come out of that depth and will not only engage that depth, but will also reshape that depth to be more in tune with the depth of the character. So it makes sense that, again, any memorization is not going to produce the same results. But I want to mention it again and again and again. Refrain from making choices. Because when you are making choices, when you are intonating, when you're already pre-deciding how a particular line is going to sound, you're killing your own creativity and you're killing the development of the character. Why? Because you already memorized that this way with that kind of intonation. And in the moment of creativity, you may want to say that line completely different, but guess what? It's still going to come out of you with that same intonation because that intonation has been deeply memorized. So be careful what you are doing, because even if that intonation is true to your character at this particular stage of their development, in 10 days, your character may be elsewhere because they are further developed, they're now richer, more complex. Therefore, of course, they want to say that line differently, especially when the partner is contributing something different, right? They want to respond to the partner in the moment, and they can't because they are bound to that intonation that you drilled again and again and again and again, because foolishly you decided that this is the way to say that line, right? Says who? So again, when you say assign these lines in a flatter way, assign them more neutrally, it's a very slippery slope because people begin to speak rabbatically, or people begin to, to just basically flatten everything and make an effort to do it. But if you turn your head off and just speak through these lines, honoring punctuation, mind you, but not obviously making, forming, shaping, and memorizing choices, right? But more engaging with the vibrations of the words and letting them affect you in any way they do, ultimately, rather than trying to figure out, ooh, this is what this sound means, right? Yes, absolutely. There is Creative Speech by Steiner. And Steiner was great influence on Michael Chekhov, also huge influence on Demidov. But Demidov took Steiner completely differently, not literally, but figuratively. He took parts of Steiner that are very helpful for the actor and left out things that are not helpful for the actor. For example, all of that interpretation of sounds where every sound is a gesture and an archetype and so on and so forth. Yes, it can be very helpful, but it can also put you in your head if you're not really a master of it. And who is a master of it? I ask you. Very few people are. So in the beginning, instead of worrying about archetypes behind sounds, why don't we just let the sounds and their vibrations affect us the way that they do, rather than trying to interpret them or shape them in a very particular way to form certain intonations and what is called line readings. If you memorize your lines with line readings, these line readings will forever haunt you, so to speak, right? So that's why Demidov is actually suggesting offering a completely different way of engaging with the lines. And yes, they do get memorized as a result, but not in that same way and not recorded into the head.
Mm-hmm. Andre, can I read you a quote by Anthony Hopkins? I'm dying to do so. So if you allow me.
Yeah.
So Anthony Hopkins says, well, I learned the text so deeply that I think it has some chemical effect in my brain. I've been playing some pretty tough guys like King Lear or this guy with dementia in The Father. It's exhausting, but I'm not a method actor in that sense. I believe in learning the text which is there. Once you know it so well that you can improvise and make it real, it's easy. You can't pretend to know it. It's impossible to. And I couldn't do it. I've worked with actors who don't know their stuff, and we're just wasting everyone's time. But I want to stay to the first part. He says, well, I learned the text so deeply that I think it has some chemical effect in my brain. Mm-hmm. I think he's describing exactly what you were saying. Of course, he's mentioning the brain, but I think he's actually talking about the subconscious, if you like. And if you allow me to
subconscious mind,
yeah, if you allow me
and
to
the brain, of course, is not restricted to the head, even anatomically speaking.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's in the body.
And the second quote, again from Anthony Hopkins, I think he's the GOAT. So he says, acting is just a process of relaxation, actually knowing the text so well and trusting that the instinct and the subconscious mind, whatever you want to call it, is going to take over. So again, something that, you know, a person that like Anthony Hopkins that has all this experience and has reached this age now, he's talking about this stuff. And I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, because if you think about it, people are going to agree in certain ways, and in certain ways they're going to disagree. And these disagreements are very important to make clear. Mm-hmm. Of course, everybody is going to say, yeah, the text is where we begin. But what do we do with that text next? Oh, trust the text, they say, right? I mean, almost every teacher says it, especially Shakespeare, teachers of Shakespeare, right? Trust the text, just trust the text. It's all in the text, right? You heard it before?
Oh, yeah.
What the hell do they mean? Not clear. Mm-hmm. So this is what it all ends up being. I go to the text, but not to the text, rather to the interpretation of the text. I chop it into a bunch of little pieces. Mm-hmm. I find whatever it is for each one of these little pieces. It can be a task or objective. It also can be a psychological gesture. It can be an intonation or a subtext. But whatever it is, it's imposed onto the text. It's not the text. Do you see what I mean? So as a result, the text is not the score, actually. What is the score? Actions are the score, because I created a score of actions. Or psychological gesture is the score, because I created a score of psychological gestures or qualities that I assigned to it, right? Which is also, one of the aspects of the Michael Chekhov technique, for example. I can also create a score of physical actions. That's Stanislavski's latest discovery, right? It's a score of physical actions because the text is turned into physical actions now. Or subtext, where every line is dissected and analyzed in terms of what it means, or at least what it means according to me, not necessarily according to Shakespeare, right? And as a result, are you following me? The score is anything but the text. We begin by saying, go to the text, trust the text says it all, and ultimately, in the end, there is anything but the text. Actions, qualities, intonations, gestures, blockings, right? Anything but the text. And what Anthony Hopkins is talking about is certainly much more along Demidov way, where the text as is submerged somewhere deep, and then I step onto the stage.
Andre, it's I'm gonna share a story, if you allow me, fairly quickly. I'm on Instagram sometimes, and I follow like the hashtag acting, so I get these silly videos, and I get mad sometimes. So, if you allow my emotions for a minute or two, so I get these videos, and there's this one very known acting teacher in New York, quite famous, quite the following, and he's quite adamant. He comes from a very specific technique. I'm not going to name names, but one of his things, and I'm not going to quote him verbatim, so I might be wrong, but what he said was, okay, the text is only 10%. The other 90%, it's subtext and the things that you do and behavior. And I do understand where he comes from and what he's talking about. But when he said that, I was like, okay, so you mean Shakespeare is 10%? Like Tennessee Williams is just 10%? Where do you come with these figures? And he was talking about subtext as if he's going outside of his house every single morning. And he's never saying good morning to somebody. He's always an innuendo of some sort. So, well, sometimes it's the words. It's not always an elaborate thing that an actor has to do, a 90% thing that you have to make a story underneath a story, or else it doesn't work.
That's exactly what they do. And for as long as it's action that is at the core of everything, which is every technique after Stanislavski, right? Even those who seemingly disagree with Stanislavski, like Michael Chekhov, ultimately create their technique based on Stanislavski's guiding principles. Except instead of action, it's going to be psychological gesture, right? And the qualities that belong to the psychological gesture. And everybody is like that. Then, of course, if at the core of everything is action, then the words suddenly become very secondary. You are mad at this teacher, this respectable teacher, but Stanislavski says the same. Stanislavski says that what happens on stage, which means actions, all of these things, is the wave. And the text is the form on the very, very surface of the wave. There is your 10% or less. Now, it certainly will be like that if you don't know how to actually engage the text or engage with the text in a very different way. Whereas Anthony Hopkins said, it begins to guide you, it begins to move you, it begins to feel through you, it begins to speak through you, right? So if your connection with the text is like that, then it's a completely different situation. If your connection with the text is non-existent, then you need a bunch of other stuff in order to get through the show. You need objectives, actions, psychological gestures. You need a lot of things that are not the text. You need to create this huge scaffolding in order to support whatever it is that you are doing. But every scaffolding that you create has to be actually dismantled for people to be able to enjoy the building. Horrible analogy, because it's not organic, it's mechanical. I only know one case when a scaffolding designed by a great architect in order to repair a certain structure was so artistic that they kept it on the building for a while, right? It's actually, it happened, it's the Washington Memorial in DC, right? The pencil. But ultimately, scaffolding has to be dismantled, and that's the problem. They can never dismantle the scaffolding, because the idea, of course, is that all of these psychological gestures, all of these actions, objectives, and so on, all of it in performance should miraculously disappear, and I am a free creator, improviser, and my subconscious takes over. How? When the scaffolding is holding me to it, I cannot free myself, because that's how I build my building. Unfortunately, it's a building. It's not a living, breathing organism. And so that's the problem, and always will be.
But there is such a close, sorry, Andre. But
keep going, keep going.
It excited me. There's such a close relation, because when you're so busy with all of that activity, it does create a tension in the body. Yeah. And that tension in the body is our kind of version of scaffolding. And you become so busy doing and so tense that nothing happens to you. And certainly there's no vibrations. And so you don't really have that experience of being taken over by the language, and certainly not the play as a whole. And as we're talking about this, it excites me so much, because I've been lucky enough to be practicing this way, this kind of assigning, for quite a long time now. Almost 10 years I've been assigning lines this way. And as we're talking about it and discussing it, I realize now it's been a long time since I've even thought about assigning my lines. And instead, what's happened is it's kind of become the thought of using the assigning of my lines as a way of getting and bringing the whole play into me. Yeah. And I don't even know if I was aware of that change at any point, except right now as we're talking about it, that really that's what it has been, that it's a way of bringing all of it into me. And this breaking up that people practice, I think oftentimes, and I haven't really thought, this before, so give me a little grace here, there is an element that I must break it up because I'm not quite big enough to hold all of it at once. And I think certainly that was true for me. There were times in my life where maybe I was big enough to hold a performance of Romeo for Romeo and Juliet, but I think Hamlet would have knocked me out. And I think certainly Lear, thank God he's so old, because there's no way I could have held that play in me, that whole play. And so, that's, I guess, my best recommendation towards this work, in this specific conversation, is the experience of having the whole play in you is just unlike anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then there is another prerequisite, because it only works under this prerequisite that on stage you give yourself full freedom. You're not trying to fulfill the text. You're not trying to illustrate the text. You're not trying to convey the text. You're not trying to play the text. Neither are you obviously trying to play characters, circumstances, relationships. You're not trying to play anything. You are following your creative urges. Under that condition, the text begins to guide you. But actors who don't have this training, of course, or who haven't arrived at it on their own without training, they're not going to be able to take full advantage of that text being actually assigned correctly, the way that great actors used to do it. Great actors of the past that had galvanizing effect upon the audience. Not the effect that today's actors have, even the best of them, right? But the way that Ira Aldrich performed, or Machalov, or Yermolova, or Eleonora Duse, where the effect was life-changing and galvanizing, literally. These actors, of course, engaged with the lines on a very different level, but they also knew how to give themselves freedom. So we have to be very clear there that just learning your lines correctly, so to speak, is not going to do it, because then you are going to benefit from it tremendously, but you may not be able to take full advantage of it if on stage you are not actually surrendering to your creative urges, and it takes training, Demidov training, to surrender to your creative urges. Then the text begins to guide you and becomes that score that it actually is. Otherwise, you need a lot of auxiliary stuff, right, that you are executing rather than you are surrendering to the mighty power of the text as it carries you, so to speak. You're right, Nolan. Within this text are encoded characters, circumstances, relationships, everything. So if you submerge the text technologically correctly into your being, then with it, you are absolutely right. You are submerging character, relationship, circumstances, everything you need to create. But then you have to trust your subconscious, because if you submerge the text, the score, as I call it, into your subconscious, then on stage in rehearsal, you have to truly trust that subconscious. Otherwise, the place where you recorded everything is not going to be able to bear the fruit. So there is also that condition.
And to do that, Andre, you'd have to be a hero.
For that, you have to be a hero. For that, you have to have training or be a hero. You're right. Because actors of the past did not have any training. They were just heroes. And today, actors are no longer heroes, and therefore they have to have training. Actors of the past were selected from thousands and only went into the theater because they couldn't live without it. Because actors of the past were not respected, very often persecuted. Acting was considered a actually very low profession, right? So actors who had other things that they could do very soon left theater because they could not actually bear the conditions. The audience was not nearly as polite, as accepting as they are now. And you were not protected by lights, sound, visual effects, right? Loud sound effects, directorial concept, costumes that could act for you or instead of you, sets that are revolving and, you know, going up and down. You were not protected by any of it. It was you against 1,000 people in the audience, just you. So needless to say, the conditions of the theater they used to be, they did cultivate heroes, and only heroes went in, and these heroes, of course, succeeded. Today, it's very different. You don't have to be a hero. What our today's actors are thinking are heroic when they go, let's say, through their training, right? Because training can be tough. Is not nearly as heroic, apparently, as their predecessors had to go through. As a result, of course, today's actors definitely need trained to be heroes, trained to be free, because the conditions are not the same. They don't cultivate heroes just by their presence, the conditions.
Talking about heroes, Andre, I think if somebody today went, if Duse was alive and somebody could approach her and went to her and talked about elements like objectives or action verbs, she would look at them sideways. It had nothing to do with that.
You know that Duse had a Russian counterpart, Maria Yermolova. Of Maria Yermolova, the great Russian tragic actress, Stanislavski wrote in a letter to Yermolova, Maria, if you traveled, nobody would even speak of Duse. So he was convinced that if Maria Yermolova, like Duse, traveled the world, because Duse, as you know, constantly traveled from country to country, right? That nobody would even think of Duse. That is how mighty Yermolova's talent was. And the reason I'm mentioning it is that actually, Kimon, it did happen. Because as Yermolova grew older, she had to let go of her parts to move on to other parts that were more appropriate for her age. And the theater where she worked, Malay Theater in Moscow, they started sending young actresses to her house so that she could teach them how to play these roles. And the actresses came and sat down, and Yermolova said, well, I don't really know if I can help you because, what should I tell you? Well, tell me about this role. Okay, you see, she loves him greatly, and he just doesn't love her back. And the actresses who were sitting there with notebooks were saying, yes, and? Oh, no, I didn't make myself clear. You see, she really loves him greatly, and he just doesn't care for her at all. Yes, but what is your super objective, and what is your through line of actions? And what is your subtext? Yermolova apparently was covered in red spots at these moments, and she was saying, my dear girls, I'm so sorry. We were so ignorant and backwards in our time. We didn't know about any of these things. I'm probably not going to be able to help you at all. Well, maybe I could just act it for you. And she stood up in her living room and acted the role. And these actresses understood that they will never be able to do anything like that for as long as they live. So here you've got a problem, because Stanislavski, when talking about his system, he says, I copied it from Yermolova. What's wrong with the picture? Yermolova did not use this technique. She did not break anything into bits and objectives. She did not find through line. She never even heard of that, and created her great roles that made her comparable to Duse. The same with Duse. They had other techniques. If they had other techniques, how could Stanislavski claim that he wrote his system based on these great actors, if they've done nothing even remotely close to whatever it is that he concocted? They had relationship with the text, but it was completely different.
Yeah.
When Yermolova listened to the play, because very often it was read by the playwright, right? She tried to fit herself into the shoes of the character. She listened to the play, or she tried to somehow adapt the character, right, to herself, but ultimately it was some kind of a movement from both directions simultaneously, which means synthesis, right, where she very often, not often, but sometimes walked out of that first reading already as character. So somehow she managed to merge with the character as she was listening to it, but ultimately it had nothing to do with analysis whatsoever. What they all used, of course, is circumstances. But that's something else, right? Because that's not what we are talking today. We are talking about. Today we are talking about our engagement with the text. And of course, for everybody, it starts with memorization. And memorization for most actors is, let's get it over with. Let's get it over with so that I could create. That's the number one mistake. When you are memorizing the lines, retaining the lines, connecting with the lines, engaging with the lines for the first time, you're already creating. Or you're shooting yourself in the foot. And so how you go about these first times that you're engaging with the lines is actually paramount. It's not I just need to commit it to memory so that later I could create. You're already shaping your character when you're engaging with the lines. You're already physicalizing circumstances, relationships, and facts. You're already molding yourself inwardly to become more like character, or you're doing none of it. And ultimately, it's either a wasted time at the end of which, yes, your head knows the lines, but the way that you learn them and the fact that they're in your head is only going to interfere with the rest of your creative process. Or you submerge the lines where they really belong, and now they're going to guide you through the rest of your creative process. It's detrimental, right? Or it is benevolent, but it all depends on your technique of engaging with the lines.
Andre, remember something you said, like, I think it's quite some time ago, but if I remember correctly, there was a discussion, and at some point you said something, the words of, the best place an actor can be, it's either with absolutely very well assigned words or none at all.
Yeah.
Like not knowing anything or knowing very well. And I loved that because, again, in both places, your subconscious is allowed to do stuff. In the middle ground, it's not.
It's not because you're in your head, because if you kind of memorize the lines, as most actors do, right? Let's be very clear and very honest. We kind of know the lines. These lines we know better than others, right? Because these ones we actually took time with, then we ran out of time. So there's a whole section that is very approximate. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah,
that means that character is approximate, relationship is approximate, right? Facts are approximate. And then the director is wondering, what the hell are they playing? Have they not even read the play? What are they doing? Well, everything is approximate. So when you know the words, the way that most of us know our words by the time we are pushed onto the stage, and that is approximately, we're neither here nor there. We are split. We are not at one with anything, not at one with ourselves, with the character, with the lines, right? So it's better not to know them at all. And how is it possible? It used to be possible because there used to be prompters. And sometimes a talented actor actually stepped onto the stage not really knowing the play. And the prompter kicked in, and the prompter gave them the text. That text was immediately, spontaneously, creatively embodied by the actor. And because they were not thinking, because what's there to think about it? I don't even know the play. They actually did it correctly because their intuition and their subconscious took over. And before you know it, it was a great performance. Mm-hmm. If the lines are deeply submerged into your psyche without any approximation, that is also a very good place to be. But usually we're in the middle. Think about the Globe, one of the greatest theater companies that ever existed. They are close to the place where I don't know anything. Because as you very well know, or maybe some of you don't, they did not read the play. The play was a commodity that was under 7 lakhs, because if my competitors, another theater, gets hold of the play, they can actually rehearse it, and rehearsals were very few at that time, like 2 rehearsals max. They could rehearse it and actually open it before me, and then I lost my money because nobody is going to go to me to see that play if they show it first, right? So the plays were actually locked, and the actors only received their roles, which is literally a roll of parchment. That's why it's a roll, right? I unroll it. There is my role, and a cue, which is 3 words before I speak that don't even indicate who speaks. So somebody is going to say, I don't know, and then I go into that monologue. But who is going to say, I don't know why, and what am I reacting to? I have no idea. So needless to say, they knew their lines. but they didn't know anything else. And right before going on stage, they may be able to quickly look at the synopsis that was posted in the weeks in terms of like mostly who comes after whom. That's why in Shakespeare, as you very well know, you are constantly hearing, but here comes such and such. Because here comes such and such is not part of that guy's cue, probably, because that guy is not going to speak until later. And unless somebody on stage says, here comes such and such is not going to show up. Because their entrance is not in their script, it's not in their role, right? Can you imagine spontaneity, freshness, unpredictability, and actually, kind of being balancing on the razor blade, right? That these actors were in, talking about living in the moment. They had no choice but to live in the moment. And apparently they were great actors. If you read Shakespeare, right, their ideals were actually very close to Demidov and Stanislavski. Just read what Hamlet has to say about acting. And they lived and they experienced and they were real, but they haven't read the play. Isn't it interesting?
Brilliant.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can't really end at a better spot than talking about the Elizabethans, at least not for me. So
No.
I think perhaps that is where we should end for this week. I don't think, it's hard to imagine a more inspiring conversation about the topic of memorization than this, because it's about so much more than that. And I hope people take that away from this. It's not this task to come at the beginning of your creative process. It is a part of the creative process. And what a wonderful thing to get to experience. As always, for those of you who are listening, if you're interested in these conversations, please reach out. We want to hear from you. And below in the description, there will be all the information for you to do that, to take a class, a workshop. We'd love to hear from you, and we look forward to it. All right. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Andre. Bye-bye.